něco forcefully out now.
Yeah.
So of course we dissidents
So hello, good morning. I would like to invite you and welcome to the international seminar with the topic Solidarity of Shaken, which is the term taken from Jan Patočka. Actually, the wish to organize this seminar came out maybe 1 year ago. The idea came from Palouš in the time when he was the director of the Václava library. My name is Marta Smolíková, and since last year I took his place, and Martin became to be board member of Václava library, and he is dealing now much more with the activities in the United States, where we set up the foundation for the library. So I'm very happy that we got the opportunity to organize this seminar in this very beautiful space, which is owned by Ilona Weiss. She's in there, thank you very much. And this wonderful house came back as a property of her family, her parents, back through restitutions. And the wish is to organize here a culture center, place for meetings and discussions. And you can see also an exhibition of Kurt Bauer, which is one of, I can say, Czech prominent artist, a professor of the Academy of Applied Art for many years, who actually is living here in the street. And what is exceptional, it's a kind of retrospective from his private pieces, from his collection, mostly the pieces he has in his home. So please be careful, because there are the statues, and I was happy that we can leave the exhibition here, but please pay the attention. So during the day here will be the catering, and don't worry if you will have something, the need to something to eat or drink, so the drinks will be there, and during the lunchtime and after there is also something to eat. So I'm happy that you came here, and please, Martin Palouš will make the introduction for the seminar, and then all the speakers and you in the discussion will participate.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Martin Palouš. I was introduced by Marta, my colleague. I'm very happy to have you here. As Marta said, it was my idea some time ago to organize this conference. So maybe there is a suspicion that I come with this idea to be able to invite my good friends to Prague, which is partly true. So I first of all would like to especially welcome those who have traveled here from different places. But it is not just friendly, it should be a very friendly conversation for sure, because this will be consistent with the theme of our explorations today. But let me maybe libres from my side to take floor as first and open up the theme. But I'm responsible for that I'm not going certainly to cover whole ground. I'm very happy that we have here a great experts on the topic, much better than I can be in my wildest dreams. But what is very important for me is that this is the first opportunity to connect the activities of Václava library and Jan Patočka archive. Václav Havel is known for many things, but I think that there is still a lot to be explored. Václav Havel as a disciple of greatest Czech philosopher of the 20th century, Jan Patočka, that this connection is extremely important, and that's maybe 26 years after Jan Patočka's death in 1977, already a little bit forgotten. So what we are going to open up today is maybe old theme, the solidarity of the shaker. It sounds strange to some people. It's a term used by Jan Patočka, and trying to bring it to our current discourse. First, just to introduce the theme of this conference, let me to read what I sent in a letter to my friends and potential participants in this conference some time ago. Our intention is to bring together a small group of scholars from different countries to discuss philosophical problems connected with the concept of human rights in the today's post-European world. The elementary point of departure should be the experience and philosophical underpinnings of Central European dissent, which had preceded the revolutionary transformations in this part of the world in 1989, namely the spiritual legacies of Václav, Havel, and Jan Patočka. Several fundamental topics will be offered for the seminar's discussion. The relationship between law-based and philosophical approaches to the questions of international human rights, the ongoing search for spiritual authority in our current post-modern, post-European world, particularly noticeable in the arguments of today's human rights defenders confronted still with the oppressive state apparatuses and totalitarian regimes, their quest for the sort of moral obligation to respect human dignity and fundamental rights, which is not only accepted in one particular cultural sphere, Euro-American civilization, and just imposed on all others, but anchored in the general human experience of the absolute. This is the quotation from Václav Havel, and as such common to all world religions and civilizations. So this is what I asked my colleague to think about and to address eventually during today's and tomorrow's conference. Let me open up with Jan Patočka himself. The term, the solidarity of the shaken. I relied heavily on experts on Jan Patočka, quite sitting here, and others coming later tomorrow, really to put this expression, concept, articulated experience, to the context of Jan Patočka's philosophical work. What I will do myself is just to identify certain follow-ups, sometimes I would say seductive follow-ups, because if we want to explore the terrain between philosophers and non-philosophers, and that's what Jan Patočka wanted from his young age. Let me just give you a taste of Jan Patočka. This is what he wrote in the age of 29, so a long time before he started to think about the solidarity of the shaken. Philosophy's most important task is not to speculate in abstracto, but to express what society has hitherto wanted without being aware of it, to put into the words its unvoiced tendencies, but also to show what is behind them, to clarify their essence, their genesis, their intricacies and problems, and eventually even to try to resolve these problems. So philosophy in Jan Patočka's context has something to do with life. So I would like to start quoting maybe at length the part from the heretical essays where the concept of solidarity of the shaken appears. So we might be certainly willing to look at the context in which these sentences were made. We would have to go back to the period of normalization, Czechoslovak situation in the times that are now really the past, to get, I would say, the understanding what is it about. We should be reminded in this context of the words of another similar great philosopher. My colleague here, very familiar with, Eric Fagelin, Austrian-American philosopher who also was exposed to totalitarian regime, who said that to be engaged as philosopher is an act of resistance against personal and social disorders of his age. So philosophers are always involved in these activities, and I think our exploration is to try to understand that in our current context. So, just to have Patočka's formulations here, let me do quote from the sixth heretical essay where the term Solidarity of the shaken appears. And I will start ex abrupto in the middle, so it will need to be explained by others during our seminar. How can the front line experience acquire the form which would make it a factor of history? So first of all, what front experience means here? Patočka starts from a big observation connected with the First World War that was explained, as he said, with the use of ideas that were coming from the past, from the 19th century, and the experience made on the ground. Experience was somewhat omitted, not taken enough into consideration. And the frontline experience is for Patočka to be exposed to the force, to be exposed to what makes history. There are many people exposed to this type of forces here even today. And then the question is, what is not becoming that? Because in the form described so powerfully by Teilhard and Hinger in the context of the First World experience, it is the experience of all individuals projected individually, each to their summit from which they cannot but retreat back to everydayness, where they will inevitably be seized again by war in the form of forced plans for peace. The means by which this state is overcome, Patočka says, is the solidarity of the shaken. The solidarity of those who are capable of understanding what life and death are all about. So what history is about. That history is the conflict of mad life, barren and chained by fear, with life at the peak. Life that does not plan for the ordinary days of a future, but sees clearly that the everyday, its life and its peace, have an end. Only one who is able to grasp this, who is capable of conversion, of metanoia, is a spiritual person. Person of spirit, however, always understands, and that understanding is not mere observation of facts, it's not objective knowledge. Even thought, even a free person must also master objective knowledge and integrate it with what matters and what is subordinate. And last sentence I would like to read is just on the previous paragraph. Those who are exposed to the pressure of the force are free, are more free than those who are sitting on the sidelines, anxiously watching whether and when their turn will come. So solidarity of the shaken is a certain bond. It's not just an insight, it's not just an idea, it's an act, which is very important, that opens certain public space, that opens certain process that can lead to what Patočka says is metanoia, the act of understanding, act which maybe can be basis of a solution of our historical problem, which is too much absorbed with everydayness, with concern of everyone to keep her life going and to solve all the daily problems, needs and routines. And by doing that, sitting on sidelines, what is not seen are those who are exposed to the force and maybe are free to say something more important than how does it look like in the beginning. This is maybe what the contemporary dissidents can tell us, still being sitting somewhere out there, marginalized. But solidarity is to get connected with this force, with this power, with this spiritual authority, and maybe this should be turned into a part of our political discourse today. I will hope that people like Ivan and others will certainly give us more insightful description how these concepts are embedded into the Patočka's philosophical thought in general. What I would do instead is that I would like to look at its immediate afterlife and then some follow-ups, because as you know, Heretic Essays was one of the last big works of Jan Patočka. Very soon after that, he committed himself to a crazy project, but maybe driven by the same thinking called Charter 77. He became spokesperson of Charter 77, and he got involved in human rights. When I suggested that human rights should be a topic of our discussion, I simply wanted to bring Jan Patočka into this discussion because Professor Jiří Přibaň is a very experienced lawyer, so he knows well that when we speak about human rights, we will start from legal instruments we have, from constitutions, from international declarations, treaties, covenants, and then we will get into very, I would say, coherent, articulate, clear concept of what today human rights are, what are the mechanisms, institutions, how they can be protected, what is the standing of individual in international context, and so on and so forth. We could go, we would look at the regional mechanisms created around European Convention on Human Rights, look at the jurisprudence of European Court, and so on and so forth. But we need to understand that this concept is in certain tension with maybe deeper concepts, and I can testify from my own experience. When I was introduced to the idea of Charter 77 by Patočka, I was not, I was blissfully ignorant of what law is. I had no much awareness of what Helsinki process was, which tried to use political means to, let's say, redefine the peaceful existence of states with different political and social systems, as it was said in the 70s. But I was driven much more by, I would say, existential concept of human rights, as the concept that departs from the ideas of Jan Patočka. And let me to again to quote what Jan Patočka's concept of human rights is, especially the one used in the context of Charter 77. Patočka says, in his really almost last text written in the beginning of 1977, shortly before he died, that idea of intention of Declaration Charter 77 is to bring to everyone's clear consciousness the truths of which we are all in some sense aware. The idea of human rights is nothing other than the conviction that even states, even society as a whole, are subject to the sovereignty of moral sentiment, that they recognize something unconditional, that is higher than they are, something that is binding even on them, sacred, unveilable, and that in their power to establish and maintain a rule of law, they seek to express this recognition. What I think can be shown, proven, elaborated in Patočka, and I think that the whole ethos of Charter 77 and Václav Havel articulated this ethos maybe more clearly than anyone else is, that human rights are not as we modern people, educated still in the context of project of enlightenment, our own entitlements, it is not that what we should be claiming to have, that it's based on the recognition of the sovereignty of moral sentiment, that it shifts our focus from the modern emancipated individual perceived as the bearer or owner, possessing them simply as something he or she is entitled to the age-old conflict between politics and philosophy. Also, trial of Socrates did lead us to our insight that what is first is not our own rights, but the rights of others. Rights we are morally obliged to defend. Patočka connects his reasoning in the area of human rights with the Kantian concept of duty. The question of human rights is not a question of my rights first, but is the question of my duty to defend, to raise the question concerning rights. It is establishment of this type of bond. This is what I think solidarity of the shaken is in action. This is what connects philosophers with people who have no idea what Socrates, Plato was, who have their own identities and perspectives. But this is something what never should be forgotten when we are discussing contemporary human rights. I had the opportunity to introduce the Václav Havel's idea of human rights last fall under the occasion of an unveiling of Václav Havel's case at the Council of Europe. So this is exactly the place where you have the current human rights embodied, enshrined in or contained in the jurisprudence in the case law of the European Court for Human Rights. Human rights that need to be interpreted in the light of changing experience. Human rights that can be had or cultivated among the like-minded states. In a society which has basically a similar idea what the concept is about. But what should not be forgotten is this existential approach. This existential approach can be sometimes very naive. I now communicate almost on a daily basis with Cuban dissidents that are now coming in large numbers from their beautiful islands and are exposed to that. And I remember from old days that this tension between philosophers and, let's say, sophisticated lawyers is what creates the tension in the area of human rights. So this would be one area I would like just to mention that. The next point is labeled parallel police. This was an experience made after Patočka already died, but where Václav Havel was very involved in. It was a simple observation that once you take this step, once you decide to leave sidelines and allow this confrontation with force, whatever embodiment of this force is, you are freed and you are finding yourself immediately in a new public space. Because there are some other people who share this experience there with you. And then space opens for what Patočka calls metanoia, for thinking. Because first what you are free to do is thinking. You can start thinking not in terms of doing everything right so that you are not getting into problem anywhere and with anybody, but really taking care about things that are transcending this everydayness of life. So this is another big topic, what kind of public space it is. There was a big dispute with all propagandists, and I think that these propagandists still are very active today in our public life, because this spirit qualified individuals to claim that they are standing for public good, for something what is not only their private good, but what is good in a public sense. So the question is how these private individuals, not appointed by anyone, but being appointed by themselves, have a courage or worse than that to speak on behalf of common good. Can individuals speak on behalf of common good? I think that Solidarity of the Shekel says that only individuals have to do it. No anonymous institution can do it for anyone. That's a first experience, and obviously the question is what kind of dangers you will be exposed to in such a situation. Obviously, the question is, are you qualified to speak about issues? It's a matter of your education, ignorance, or non-education. What comes up very clearly in this public space. But this public space is something what I think needs to be very much taken into consideration. And this public space, is it, let's say, limited as in the case of Socrates to the citizens of one polis, Athens? Socrates had his dispute with his fellow citizens. Or is it this public space something that has, by definition and by its nature, international dimension? Transcending not only in the sense of, I would say, vertical transcendence, but crossing over the borders. Connecting people, regardless whether they belong to this or that nation state. Challenging sovereignty and trying to create a space for now quite in the area, in the context of the United Nations, accepted concepts of sovereignty as responsibility. Sovereignty that is limited, and what is the limitation? I think Patočka says that very clearly, is the absolute, I would say, supremacy of moral sentiment. Even states are supposed to be respecting that, and they cannot claim that if it must be done, if state interest is so, we are right to kill people, we are right to torture people, we can do everything because state needs to come first. So this is what I think is the clear message coming from the public space called parallel polis. And this phenomenon, I think, is still alive, and if you then go, and there are people who can correct me, to the area of individual criminal responsibility under international law, and if you look at the certain situations and institutions being discussed today, I think that the experiential background is here and is very much present. Next point, I don't want to speak too long because I would like to have it and through all the seminar as an interactive exercise, is let me to give you very quickly the description of my ongoing dispute, controversy, or disagreement with a good friend of mine, Timothy Garden-Ash, who right after the revolutions of 1989, quoting from François Furet, French historian, says, with all this fuss and noise, not that one single new idea has come out from these revolutions. And I was puzzled by that, but never been able to explain to Timothy Garden-Ash what kind of new ideas have come from our revolutions, because our revolutions were, let's say, liberal revolutions, and what we wanted to do was to restore the liberal order that we were, for whatever reason, separated from for 40 kings. But I now understand that in the context of what I said already, old ideas versus from experience. What I think is extremely important, and this is something what I would then formulate as maybe two principles of solidarity of the shaken, is that is rather sees its point of departure in experience and in our ability to transform experience into certain form of knowledge. We are tapping into a very old concept of knowledge, which even precedes philosophy. that can be seen in old Greek tragedies, maybe. And to this movement, which we are obliged to make, sometimes very vulnerable, blissfully ignorant, not having ideas at our disposal, but only our experience and ability to share experience with others who are out there, and maybe being able to express only solidarity with them. What I will say is that the first rule would be that action takes over non-action. That if you know that you don't know, and you wait for Godot and still stay on sidelines, and don't risk that you will do something that will punish you, as all tragic heroes were punished, I think that you are deadly wrong. And then the second, and even more important principle, and I call it noetic solidarity. That people who are exposed to solidarity of the shaken must be able to understand together with those with whom they don't necessarily agree with. That there is something very obsessive in our current political discourse here, that once you don't agree with someone, you first start fighting with him, instead of listening to him, instead of giving a space and chance for some process to happen. And I think that Solidarity of the Shaken speaks about this process that needs to start, that needs to be strengthened, and as Patočka said, that needs to be turned into a real factor of history. That needs to be seen more as a isolated, exotic, crazy, lunatic call or cry of someone who maybe suffers but is crazy and not relevant for serious political business today. So Solidarity of the Shaken tries not to overplay that, but to strengthen the voice. So Patočka speaks, let me just to say what I have not said about the Solidarity of the Shaken yet, but again we can give voice to Patočka. Solidarity of the Shaken is built up in persecution and uncertainty. That is, its frontline quiet, without fanfare or sensation, even where this aspect of the ruling force seeks to seize it. It doesn't fear being unpopular, but it rather seeks it and calls out quietly, wordlessly. And he says humankind will not attain peace by devoting and surrendering itself to the criteria of everydayness and of its promises. All who betray this solidarity must realize that they are sustaining war and are the parasites on the sidelines who live off the blood of others. The sacrifices of the front line of the Shaken powerfully support this awareness. The concept of sacrifice is extremely important here, and again, Patočka, scholars and experts will have a chance to explain it to us. I will finish my short remarks because what I wanted was just to set the scene and with hope that something will fill the gaps I have just opened. Let me to finish by a very sobering remark I got, but very nice one, from our good friend Václav. I invited him also to participate in this seminar. My mistake was too late and he could not make it. And just to explain to you, the idea of pozdní věk, the time where it's late time, is very central for his thoughts in the 1970s and in the 1980s. So he wrote me, dear Martin, I'm sorry, but it is too late now. I can't be in Prague for this occasion. It's a pity because it is a big theme, but I'm afraid it is outdated. Inhabitants of or members of society in times even later than late society are so that they cannot be shaken by anything. it would need more serious preparation, which is not now. It's not out of my possibilities. I hope that we'll have a cup of coffee one day in Prague. Greetings from Václav and the end of my introduction. Thank you. I don't know whether someone wants to step in with whatever remark. Chances now, we still are doing fine in time. Next is a better tree than me, Jiří Přiván. But let's start a conversation, because the way how we are going to do that is we would like to give enough time to every speaker, enough time for post-speakers' conversations, communications, and then even to enjoy beautiful weather outside and have a cup of coffee and maybe informal communications. So, what do you think about this project? Chip, you want to say something?
You read my mind. When you were talking about the question of public space, as the question of its transcultural, transnational opening, and you used the Socratic situation to talk about the public space being contained within the public space. It made me think about the movement in Stoicism, where something like a recognition of, I wouldn't say moral sentiment, but moral reason becomes the basis for a responsibility which is avowedly transnational and grounded in the notion of cosmological responsibility. Do Patočka, do Havel, do anybody you know, Arendt, talk about public space in the context of the Stoic development?
Ivan Tvatík certainly is more qualified than I am to answer this question, but I think that Patočka certainly covered this theme. Havel, I think, maybe intuitively. I just forgot to read to you. This is what because one of the themes that needs to be covered here is this concept of European and post-European situation, especially in the area of human rights, because the troubling question is whether the others are also party to our project. And this is what Havel said in his speech in 1995 under the opening of the new Palace of Justice in Strasbourg. There has been much discussion about whether human rights are, in the form which is now accepted in the Euro-American cultural sphere, are truly universal. That is, whether their observance can be required if everyone, or whether they are only a product of one particular culture that cannot be imposed upon other cultures which are based on different world outlooks and different traditions. If we were to perceive human rights as a mere product of social contract, the answer to this question would be clear. We would have no rights whatsoever to demand that they be observed by anyone who has not subscribed to this contract and who had no part in devising it. No group can justifiably claim that what its members have agreed upon among themselves applies automatically to everyone else as well. Nor can it purport that only what this particular group deems right is truly universal and right for all. If we, however, recognize that respect for human rights as a political requirement or imperative is actually a political expression of moral obligations anchored in the general human experience of the absolute, any reasons for relativist skepticism cease to be valid. While this recognition alone doesn't win any battles, at least it paves the way. Universality of human rights can be successfully defended if we look for its truly universal spiritual truths. That is, if we join forces in a search for what most cultures have in common, and if we attempt a new reflection on the most profound points of departure from which our manifold cultures have grown. In reality, these starting points are much closer to one another than they now seem to be. The more we cling to the mere surface of things, the more the otherness of diverse cultures conceals the depth of affinity among them. The way to genuine universalism doesn't lead through compromises among various contemporary forms of otherness, but in a joint quest to bring back humanity's common primeval experience of the universe and of the human beings within it. So I think that it answers your question.
Thank you for your wonderful opening statement. Great pleasure to be here. I liked a lot the phrase you used towards the end in your debate with Garth Nash, noetic solidarity. And I'd like to ask you the question about whether we are living in a world today, which is after all quite different from the one of Charter 77 36 years ago because of means of communication. There's been a revolution over the last 20 years in the forms of global social media, which should in one sense make it more or make it easier to understand the plight of others. But on the other hand, many fear that this is a sort of global conversation that is very fragmented, that disappears into its different holes, where you have different sort of idiosyncrasies that are being, that are flowering, instead of this sort of global noetic solidarity. You don't have to answer this, but I just want to put it on the table as one of those things that I think is right before us as a challenge and a problem.
Well, it's an interesting question of, I would say, temporality of temporal aspect of noetic solidarity, because what you are describing is a generally known phenomenon. Everything is too fast today. You even cannot cultivate differences between opinions because they are so fast replaced by something else. I mean, noetic solidarity is just to, as Hannah Arendt would like to say, to stop and think. Thoughtlessness of Adolf Eichmann, as described by her, was thoughtlessness of someone who, whenever he happened to have an idea or thought, it immediately was absorbed, disappeared in this never-ending flow of instructions, orders, and administrative arrangements, so that he never had a chance to stop and think and maybe ask the question, God, what I'm doing. And so we need to find a way, if we want to take this Patočka's call seriously, how to do it, but in a speed which corresponds to our human nature and to our ability to see the other faces. I don't think that we should not use this marvelous instrument that we can communicate via email and exchange letters in seconds. But we must be aware, I believe, that this fastness of this communication is kind of scary. Yes, please.
Yeah. I think that we are all the time, the humankind, and we are all the time the same, because the problems, even in this very fast period of changing of meanings and so on, is, the problems are there and they are the same. That is my question, what do you mean about this post-European? What is that? Because now many forces in Europe is trying to make the real functioning Europe. And what is that?
I skipped this point. This is the Patočka's concept. His argument is that the European age, European time, in certain sense, is over. If you take Europe as a leading imperial power on the world, dictating what is science and what is not, then from a certain moment, and maybe the First World War is that moment that exposed the vulnerability of Europe very much, and the Second World War only confirmed this trend. So that people like Patočka in the 1970s already were talking about that, and their solidarity of the shaken certainly connects with, let's say, Gandhis of this world, or people from around the globe. But it doesn't mean, and Patočka is very serious about that, that European legacy, what remains from Europe, should be forgotten and let as a non-existent factor. Patočka certainly is stating that everybody believes that Europe's most visible and most important legacy is science, technology, and all these products of interventor reason. But this is exactly what generates and gives to force the ability to manipulate with us. So the question is whether there is something else like European legacy. For Patočka, it would be the Socratic character for soul. It would be his way how to use, let's say, old project of Edmund Husserl, of the crisis of European science, to understand the world, as he says, to make the first steps from the European world to post-European world and enlighten ourselves in this situation. Maybe the Havel's call for search or quest for universality of things, transcending civilizational, cultural, historical backgrounds is that. And by the way, this gentleman, he is a strong supporter of European project on European Federation. There are certain elements of this project Europeans can be very much proud of, and I think that jurisprudence in the area of human rights or the whole case law of the European Court is a tremendous, not only instrument to deal with human rights problems of inhabitants of European member states of the Council of Europe, but it is something that really should inspire the world. Obviously the question is what are the interstate institution structures that can just institutionally materialize that, but solidarity of the shaken is maybe the most important European legacy, and this is what Patočka's message of his essays on philosophy, in the philosophy of history are about.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you want to?
I will have time to.
Okay, so it's. Are we right on time or? Okay, so let's have a 10 minutes break or 15 minutes break. Enjoy the sun and coffee, and then you will have a better treat tonight.